Buenos días.
Good morning. We are going to start our last session for our morning panel. We are discussing European identity in a global context. What role does culture play? Our last speaker is Delia María Manzanero Fernández. She's president of the Philosophy Association Bajo, Palabra and a Word. She's also a PhD and a professor of philosophy of law at University Rey Juan Carlos. And one special thing that I would like to say about her is that she belongs to the European network of alumni of Yuste because she received a postdoc grant when the Charles V award was granted to Simone Weil. Among our goals, we want to preserve the link that comes through our organization, especially those who receive a postdoc grant, so that they continue to work with us and they supply us with their knowledge. Delia, it is a real honor and a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for accepting our invite, and without further ado, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y a todas.
Good morning to you all. I wish to thank Miguel Ángel, his kind words. I also remember in 2011 when I was here in the framework of the scholarships, and I can see how the foundation is enriching its activities and with increased membership. I wish to thank the European Academy of Yuste Foundation and its director, the good idea of organizing a course related to the European integration through cultural policies in plural, so as to speak of plurality and the topic of the citizens' participation, which is usually a bit neglected. We can see that there is a great audience. I think there were close to 200 applicants, and the number had to be limited, but this is a good symbol of the importance of the topic. The topic I'm going to speak about has to do with a research line where the recovery of a tradition of a humanist liberal tradition is trying to be recovered. Krausism, which is a very strong philosophy in Spain, which was a phenomenon of European nature, is originated in Germany, but it was also projected to France, to Belgium, and that it is not only European, but it's also pro-European, not just European, but pro-European. It is a real idea of European integration. My research has to do with recovering that tradition of Krausism and institutionism, which is in the Silver Age of Spain, one of the main assets. It is what Giner de los Ríos, Posada, Azcárate, their theses are quite interesting to be quoted here because they're very relevant for the educational and political challenges which we have to face right now. This is then a revitalization which is needed both for historical reasons. This legal philosophy is a key for the history of Spain, but also for the conditions of the world where we're living with transgression of fundamental rights and the crisis in Europe. It is not simply an anachronistic reflection, but to see how many of the Krausist proposals have been incorporated to our models and our legal and social systems. And that can be seen, for instance, in a very clear way in the fundamental contributions that this idea of Krause and the institution in Europe has in political programs nowadays. For instance, human rights, the European Constitution, the foundational defense of those human rights by Krausism is very relevant and has been very important for the modern constitutionalism. In particular, I will try to show through my presentation how some of the proposals of the Spanish Krausism may be fruitful in human rights, in global education, and for the contemporary social theory that is being implemented today in Europe. As you know, the panel is involved in the thematic axis of the reflection on the European identity in a global context. And the question we are asked is, what is the role that culture should have in this multicultural context? To try and define the content that generally is attributed to the European identity as a cultural identity in our current context of globalization and multiculturality, which defines our present, is not an easy task. Today, we live in multicultural political communities which are embedded in a context of increasing globalization marked by phenomena of massive immigration, which also entails an internal differentiation, which is also increasing, and which makes it difficult to the self-understanding of Europe. This is what Jeremy Waldron had defined as the meta-ethical Babel to define that plurality, although I prefer the metaphor by José María Jover to describe a Europe that, notwithstanding its unity, he defined it as a lyre with many strings, to describe that emerging polyphonic reality full of many voices, divergent voices, almost never harmonic, and that precisely because of that needs new views so that the original ideas adjust to the new challenges of the 21st century in this Europe, which is increasingly multiracial, multi-religious, where we are immersed right now. In the face of this increasing pluralism, are some of the principles and moral perspectives in our increasing pluralism can be defendable nowadays? Is it possible a harmonicist solution as the Krausists propose, or are we meant to fight between cultures? The reply of Krausists to this question is that if we research on how the reaction has been referring to pluralism, law has acquired more value and incorporating a stronger axiological charge. And this is so because the globalization phenomenon has not only been at an economic level. This is a phenomenon that has implied aspirations in law and in international justice. And this is important to remark. That is why, as we have seen in these couple of days, all the panels spoke towards a more human Europe and a European Union that is less technocratic and more inclusive. The proposals by these philosophers shed light on the complex issue of sense and the basis of the European cultural unity. And as Enrique Ureña used to say, we should interpret this so that pro-European thinking should go towards universalism, so that a new reading of the theme of the European Constitution can be read of the motto unity in diversity, so that we can get an only voice which is credible at international scale. In the face of theses that speak of antagonism of European peoples and the impossibility of an only European people. Krausism defends civic solidarity and a humanizing praxis which goes beyond the nation state and that can base a form of post-national identity which may determine a future European identity. So, apart from cultural varieties and differences, Krausists do not doubt that Europeans share some features of civilization. This is not just a thesis of Krausism, but also a thesis of Jürgen Habermas in an essay on the building of European political identity, where he is in favor of choosing those building blocks of the European identity from a wider context that reconciles those antagonic national histories. The arguments he proposes is quite suggestive and very convincing. As Habermas says, there's no obstacle whatsoever to the civic solidarity to grow beyond nation state, at least none that has been built on the basis of political solidarity among strangers, which is the one that now prevails within national borders. End of quote. This is also a consequence of globalization. There's no homogeneity inside the nation states. That is why Habermas says that we may expect that the same as the building of national identities through nationalization of a state was what marked the history of Europe at the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, one could expect that the development of the European integration of its institutions and social policies are and will be the ones that will facilitate little by little the building of European identity in the 21st century. Another issue, which is no less important, is the risk of lacking the support of the citizens, with the deficit of legitimacy and cohesion if we don't find a certain cultural identity in this process of European integration. In the legal Krausist philosophy of cosmopolitanism, one can see a basis which is maybe quite useful, particularly for its reinforcing at international or world level through the orientations in cultural and educational integration. Culture and education are going to be the main nodes to speak of the European integration. What Krausists contend is that precisely that need of sharing a link of belonging in the sociological scale is more social than legal and should be based on a series of values able to give and to provide a shared meaning to the majority of European citizens that make it possible that they belong to a European culture and an institutional system which is legitimate and valuable. This way of associating requires changing the immigration and integration policies which allow to create denationalized and deterritorialized associations in order to integrate immigrants in the EU and to foster new political participation spaces in networks of transnational solidarity. These social formations that allow precisely to vertebrate that plurality that exists. Under this sociological component of the Krausist doctrine, society, according to these authors, has and preserves its own and spontaneous legal life. This is quite important. It's the social habits and the public opinion what generates that sociological component. According to this Krausist approach, citizens would be more active and more prone to adhere to a common project, which may have a positive effect on their political participation and their integration. For example, Adolfo Posada is a Krausist who proposed a very interesting vision of trade unionism and the social function of the freedom of association, the local autonomism, federalism. These are fundamental theses, ideas which are paying attention not just to national interests and the balance of powers, but also the keeping of European solidarity based on shared values. It is then a position that intends to avoid the laissez-faire, which of an individualist coinage, and which intends human solidarity and increasing exigencies of social interdependence. In the last years, the most promising development of cultural cooperation in Europe has been precisely thanks to the enormous development of the civil society, and not only that, but also NGOs through associations, foundations, cultural networks. And in this course, there have been a good number of representatives of this type of associations. So this has been confirmed in practice, this Krausist doctrine of the prevailing associationism. When Posada makes the distinction of Giner de los Ríos between the official state and the non-official state, he emphasized the necessary social and ethical coexistence between both states, so that the legal measures are not limited to a formal or legal level. And what the Krausists were doing was to recreate one of the contemporary practices of cultural cooperation of the highest success. For example, the alliances between international institutions such as the UNESCO or the EU, and alliances between European states with civil society, something that is done at different levels, adapting conveniently their programs through at different levels of interaction. For instance, at level local, regional, national, international, of the European scale. There is a search for forms of social organization that foster participation and involvement of the association tissue. And it's thanks to that cultural cooperation that the relations between civil society and public powers can be dynamized, increasing the ability of reciprocal listening between each other. This is important for the model of Europe, which we are trying to implement here. This has to do with the cultural and citizen participation issue. The other big vector where I want to base my panel or my talk is education, which plays a very important role in Krausist philosophy for that reunification of Europe, for the integration of adhering states, and for the cooperation with neighboring countries to the Union. Perhaps this is not that explicit, but we shouldn't look at Europe as if it were the only focus, and we should think of cooperation with the Mediterranean or with other neighboring countries. Education here is a fundamental element for that in European integration, but also to prevent extremism of a violent type and to promote awareness raising campaigns against hatred and discrimination, to promote social inclusion of children through education, training, and de-radicalization programs. So we should remember those words by the Krausists when they said it should be good if the governments stop making laws, and if only laws were left to politicians and laws, and they concentrated more on the phenomenon of education and stopped legislating the back of the civil society. Giner used to say, if everything depends of the interior man, we should really train it. Giner and other Krausists repeat that with that expression of laws, decrees, what for? If, as you say, we have no people to apply them. End of quote. All social reform which is valid should start from that psychological basis, and that reform of the interior man does not derive from Kantian individualism, but rather on solidarity and socially and ethically based. And the metaphor used by Rafael Altamira, that great historian, is that constant re-education that reciprocally we cause each other almost without noticing it, day to day, through the behavior of the others, through the word that we receive of that we don't receive at all. This links personal ethics and all the legal reforms to the deepest parts of education. I share with Krausists this conviction. Only from an ethical platform and its embedded situation in education, only critique and improvement of law can take place. So this practical feature and the civic ideal and educational ideal is what is attached to the democratic man. This said, the demand made by Giner of a moral education, and even more the emphasis of the fortunate vindication made by Krausists of the right to education, the right to education as a fundamental right of every human being, which to me is probably one of the most efficient tools that have been formulated in order to fight against social discrimination and to guarantee equality of opportunities and stability and the persistence of law. John Dewey would say that full democracy can only be reached through civil society and education. This idea, which is so Krausist, that only slow works are the ones that prevail through the safe and pacific means of education, is possible a solid reform, are perhaps today principles that could be shared. But if we think of the time when they were writing at the beginning of the 20th century, these were on their own, basically preaching in the desert. This is the legacy of the Krausists, this idea that only through education, pedagogy, innovation in education, which are the central elements of the institución libre de enseñanza. I guess everybody knows the free institution of teaching in Spain. These central elements are the ones that make it possible a reform of Spain and therefore of the Society of Nations, the League of Nations, and the integration of Europe. According to this, I think that Krausists were not lost when they pointed at these ideas. And I think that one of the main mechanisms that has contributed the most in the last decades to the building of the European identity has been precisely education, with the help, of course, now of the new digital media, internet, and also the pan-European linguistic policies, which facilitate that intercultural dissemination of all languages in all countries. The possibility that this cultural and educational link can be anchored is based on a democratic vision of citizenship. And this is also important to be remarked. We are departing from a very democratic vision of citizenship versus a more formal thing as a mere legal status, which entails the need of social participation. Once again, we are talking about this summer course of the citizen practice, apart from the formal recognition of certain obligations and duties, and rights. emphasizes the fact that the citizen, apart from rights and duties, it has effective participatory paths to sustain and promote their own culture. The function of the modern intellectual, as Habermas has made it clear in one of his articles, Intellectuals and Europe, where he speaks of the fact that intellectuals can have an impact in the formation of public opinion of citizens, but they need a public audience with a resonance, a well-informed and aware environment where political culture is not limited to the state, where there is a political culture that facilitates protest, dissidence, where communicative liberties of citizens can really develop and mobilize. This ability of citizens to conform themselves autonomously in a global society and the model of education where it is based is one of the nuclear points of the legal philosophy of Krause and some of the focal points of the democratic possibilities of contemporary society. One of the proposals of the Krausist philosophical line emphasizes the need to foster cooperation and coordination at intergovernmental level in cultural education and training matters in Europe, recreating a democracy made for the common man. Instead of legal rulings, what we are observing here in the work by Krausists is a great optimism for education, for the rational deliberation, for the pedagogical methods that can really reach the citizens' conscience and that can help the right and law to have a recognition of an ethical nature. So civility and multiculturalism would be now based not in a mere regulation of hatred or indifference between cultures, which is something that we normally observe. This morning was said that the integration policy should be more inclusion policies. It is not simply to regulate that difference between cultures and that opposition, but also but rather a concept of civility based on the participation of certain collective goals that are considered valuable. These and other problems of European identity are the ones that Krausist philosophy has valuable responses. For instance, emphasizing that the most characteristic thing of the European identity, according to the Krausists, is to the first awakening of the universal civilization, justice, civilization, democracy, tolerance, human rights. They depart from enlightenment and from the ideal of the classical Greece. And the quid of the question is precisely the recovery and the deepening in these universals that at first sight might constitute those common elements of the European cultural identity. It wouldn't be possible to limit it to the European area because the success of Europe to project those universals to other peoples that they do not serve now as characteristics of the European specificity. The point made by Krausism of universalism makes sense because they overcome that elitist thesis of European culture based on exclusion of the other rather than the affirmation in front or versus difference. The legacy of the Enlightenment is precisely the opening to other models and to other cultures, is the critical reason that allows to awake from the dogmatic dream where fundamentalism is based and that fosters the ability to meet, dialogue, association, starting by the non-hegemonic cultures and those that are close to Europe. I'm going to finish, but I wish to refer, because one should mention the role some of the Spanish Krausists in the promotion and the advocacy of the 14 points of Wilson and the League of Nations, to show that universal vocation and that deep faith in culture and the possibilities of a social change through an ethical change of man, which are very interesting positions, which are quite revolutionary and that have no match in those days. If you think of the time when they were writing in a historical context, which was basically marked by the imperialist and war mongering ideals and even eugenicity were prevailing in Europe. So what I want to show here is that authors of Krausist legacy, like Ginero or Posada, navigated against the mainstream, since they adopted an opposed position to the majority in the in the European conception in those days. So they made a critique to the imperialistic orientation that was under those nationalist doctrines of political totalitarianism. And I will do that through the presentation of the defense made by these philosophers of the supranational states and their unconditional anti-war thinking, where they gave a very current or very modern vision of the problem of war. Posada recovers the idea of the harmonist conception, which defends the idea of community against rivalry, for example, against Carl Schmitt, for whom many of you know the essence of the political was on the explicit possibility of an open war at any moment. So everything was aligned between friend and foe. Posada refused and made a critique of these points made by Schmitt and the characterization of the political medium as combat. His critiques are addressed to the European crisis because of the exacerbation of the nation, which was against a collective conscience among Europeans, and which would lead to the First World War, which Posada called very significantly as the first great civil war of humankind. In its place, Posada contended until the end of his life the advocacy of a more human world, unarmed and based on education. I wanted to underscore this because it's important to talk of these expressions compare them with the literature of those days. In this context of disputes, Krausists were clearly in liberal positions because they trusted in reason and they were more coherent and more free than the one that Europe took in those years. And perhaps it has its relevance these days. When we see, for instance, these new waves that the crisis has brought back, the demons of racism, the discourse of exclusion, xenophobia, which are elements which are contrary to the Krausist solidarity. According to this issue, it is relevant to talk in this difficult territory to say among these growth of anti-European forces and xenophobic forces. I wanted to recover this thesis of Krausism, of a European project that is more based in what unites us than what separates us, and to keep us alert in order not to be in self-complacent conformism. Benedetto Croce said that all history is in reality contemporary history, and in this sense is very well brought about because the Krausist thesis of integration and European solidarity are very modern in the 21st century. I want to close, and I will simply focus very succinctly in 2 minutes what I consider the most important contributions of Krausism, not just because of their vision of law as an integrating and educating principle, but because what they said in this matter of education and integration, what they said is that once the emancipation goal had been achieved, Krausism said that we shouldn't stop there, that we should the work of integrate them, that give them a sense of social justice of a positive nature based on solidarity and essentialist and essentially human. And this is the core of what we are talking here when we speak about a soul for Europe. This is based on these principles and on this idea and this form of thought, which together with other social ideologies is what has crystallized in the law or the rule of law, where we have those economic, social, and cultural rights with Krausists, so quite in advance. The right to education, which I have already referred to, the protection of the university's autonomy, and the freedom of teaching, the definition of culture as an essential human goal, which was promoted from the Institución Libre de Enseñanza and the Junta de Ampliación de Estudios, the precursors of what is now the Erasmus program, and of course the right of education for women. Women had been traditionally excluded, and this changed thanks to that idea of Giner de los Ríos of co-education between boys and girls at school. Also the right to participate in the cultural life through association, freedom of union, of trade unionism, a continuous improvement of the conditions of existence in order to reach to that social harmony which was so important. These problems are not restricted to that cultural context of the 19th century, but that continue perhaps even more now the contemporary problems, particularly seeing the destruction of the welfare state that the recent global crisis has provoked, economic and financial, yes, but it has also brought out a moral and social crisis that we are still suffering, and that is an omen for trouble in this century. That is why I make the emphasis in these philosophical premises of Krausism, because what I believe is still very much alive is their confidence in certain utopian ideals that might be applied to possible reforms and to orient the political activity of our politicians. Thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Delia.
Thank you very much, Delia. Undoubtedly, this has been a very interesting presentation in regard to contents, very rich, and it offers arguments, many arguments, so that we can carry out our work. There is no doubt that the work of those thinkers at the time bear their fruit, and that's where my doubt comes into shape. Is the current EU, is it the fruit of that struggle? Was their influence such because it seems that all of their thesis of these thinkers, did they influence the European Union? Or was it just by chance? Because the two world wars brought us where we are now. That's the doubt that I usually come up with. Because maybe what we managed to have is thanks to the unknown work that you just presented, because probably many of you did not know the Krausist theories, because I knew them because I knew you. When they tell you about the work of those type of people who try and change society, then one asks himself, is it really the lack of reasoning that brought us to this reasoning? Did we fight and struggle to achieve this? Of course, now the floor is given to the audience in case there is some question. Professor Alcala is raising his hand now. First of all, thank you for this spectacular conference. It makes me think about several questions that could be interesting to go one step further. The example of the ideal, of the Krausist ideal, is exemplary, and it sets the path, a horizon, a world to be achieved. However, some of these ideals of the Krausists in Europe and in Spain in particular, they were achieved. In 1981, when I had to do the military force here in Spain and I was mandatory recruited, I went to the university militia instead of wasting my time for a year. And so I worked for 6 months, and I was horrified of the fact that in 1981 we had so many students that did not know how to read or write. They were illiterate. That came to an end. It seemed that illiteracy was almost over in Spain, and Spain was full of university students. That seemed to be one of the ideals of Krausist, and it seemed to be achieved in Spain. But if we have a deeper thought, then we realize that even though we are all enrolled at school, this does not mean that there is an excellence in university. So maybe we should think about what we want to achieve. Do we want to achieve the education for all? Everybody goes to university, or should we question ourselves, what is the meaning of education? What is the meaning of culture? Because if we do not think about it, then we will be demagogic, because government after government is taking education towards where it is important to have parts of society being illiterate, because it's easy to say, well, you know maths, you know how to add, you know how to read and write, then you are cultured. You have culture within society. But if you do not know how to interpret the media, for instance, then you are illiterate in a way. So should we rethink what these ideals mean, and if we should focus on a deeper meaning for these ideals? And you're an expert in the field, so maybe you can answer to this question. Thank you for this question, because it is true that the two suggestions that you made take us to the same path. The ideals were frustrated. For instance, for the League of Nations, the peaceful ideal failed, and the 14 points of Wilson, they were not practically applied, although some foundations were being laid, which made possible the international legal framework. But at educational level, I'll say the following. When I started my research 10 years ago, I thought, well, that's very basic because we all have the same rights. When we went to Oxford to give presentations, everything was so crystal clear that I felt that, well, we're just talking about what already exists. But when the crisis came at world level, and this has not only been a financial and economic crisis, because new waves of extreme right policies and the Front National in France and in the Netherlands, they have some extreme parties, and in Germany as well. All of these meant that when I went to Birmingham and talk about Krausism and the ideal of Europe, they hear me and they think, well, that has never clicked in Europe. And it's been reviewed once and again. In this Congress that I went this year, More or Less Europe, it was called, it was held on the 23rd of June, this meeting. So imagine when we talked about more or less Europe, and in the UK they were talking about less Europe. After having seen the news, we heard in the news Donald Trump and how happy he was about the Brexit. And imagine how we could go with the Krausist thesis and ideas and what we could discuss. In the UK, for instance, talking about Krausist ideas was a revelation. And my research took a new turn because at the time those ideas failed and they were accused of being utopical, but without utopia we would still be in the dark ages. And seeing as we see today how we are losing rights, and a colleague of mine said that what we are dealing with the Brexit is the loss of some basic and fundamental rights. So we are creating first category and second category of citizens, depending on whether they had residency permit or not. Most university teachers in England, they come from many other countries. And so they were quite worried about the results of the Brexit. And I believe that Krausism is not easy to apply, given the dilemmas and the problems that are affecting us now. Guido wants to intervene.
Well,
Intentamos
thank
ser
you.
breves también para poder.
Well, I'll be very brief. I mean, you reminded us that in many ways modern Europe was founded on the ideas of altruism and in some way universal civilization, which necessarily stemmed from the destructions of the Second World War. But in a way, how does this reconcile with the thinking of the modern realists, including people like Henry Kissinger, who feel that the relations between nation states are necessarily based on competition? This was a concept, of course, which already existed in the 1850s, but now more and more we are seeing a certain egotism resurgent in the relations between both the members of the European Union and between states in general on the world scene. So aren't we just now going back to normal, which is competition and egotism, rather than towards an ideal world of cooperation and altruism as Kraus advocated?
Excelente. Sí, creo que es suficiente.
I think it's a complex question.
Perfect.
Yes, I think that Krausists were men of their time. The shadow of Krausism cannot be that long, and what the legal realists and all those who think of the international scene as a struggle and competition, and the twilight theories, which I believe are those who give us a perspective from the third world, and they make us think about how international law is not that universal. This should be taken into account because these authors are still in an enlightening time. They're also people of their time. In the Krausists and the Krausism doctrine, we have an answer for pluralism and the idea of competition, and that the legal system has to be a reflection of that pluralism. All democratic system and state has to reflect that pluralism. But what Krausists tell us is that thanks to, this pluralism is not enough. We need values. We need to give the law substantive value so that we can face that pluralism that already exists in the Constitution. And I think that they are right with their ideal and with their perspective of universalism, which is not innocent, and that it does not ignores that their ethnocentric idea can sweep the ideal of humankind. But we need an ideal to set the next steps forward. Here, human rights would be the threshold before which multiculturalism would have to stop. Human rights are going to be the last guarantee. It would be the Ariadne thread or the voice of conscience that will allow us to guide through the European Minotaur labyrinth that we all need to weave. It needs citizen participation so that we can avoid what happened on the 24th of June, where many pro-human rights professors, they had nothing else to study because there was no European common law to show in the UK and to teach. We were all surprised by the results. We knew it could happen, but we didn't expect these results because we take everything for granted. Then there have been many demonstrations, people complain, they try to go back, but that was done afterwards because we're a bit latent. We think that rights are given forever, that we do not need to struggle and to fight for them. Politics cannot just be a thing of politicians. 2 more questions to close this session.
Ahí.
Hola, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Very interesting, your presentation. First of all, I have to recognize my lack of knowledge of the proposal of Krausism. I tried to deepen in it, but I always stayed in the surface because my teachers told me not to deepen more on this proposal, which was in a way based on or in the limits or in the fringes. What it is less clear for me, and I would like you to clarify, is the interaction between the evolutionist system of Darwin in Britain and the incorporation of those ideals here in Spain, and how this clashes with the intransigence of that moment and will allow the creation of the Institución Libre de Enseñanza when the chair of Santiago, or rather Moreno, loses his chair in Santiago because he presented the Darwin proposals. Thank you for your question. This is important for our tradition of our Spanish thought. These authors were basically banned in those days. They were removed from their chairs because they imported those doctrines, Spencer, Froebel, all those theories. They brought them, and then they met school of neo-scholastic, which was very reactionary, which immediately accused them of heterodoxy, and it is so collected by Menéndez y Pelayo, and they were removed from their chairs. They were silenced, and perhaps their work is not known nowadays by students. I go to my classes and that people do not know about the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, or that they know no Giner de los Ríos, is a generation of philosophers and sociologists, particularly after the Civil War. There has been an idea of put them in hiding, and it hasn't been recovered, that tradition, up until now. For example, from the University of Comillas, where there are research projects to recover these people. It is almost archaeological work, and it'll take a long time to see that those doctrines that were censored in those days and that suffered purges of our official programs in education, because they were revolutionary, precisely because of that, and because they were modern. The last question. Don't you think it is dangerous or risky to embrace that universalist yearning from wherever it comes, even simply because of historical humility? Because when you spoke of universal civilization, you've spoken of human rights, reason, etc. But the revision of those concepts, none of them are universal coming from Europe. Perhaps the one which is doubtful is the human rights concept, but there are many theoreticians and activists that make a critique of human rights because they are Eurocentric, not to speak of reason or the elimination of the myths that Europe hides, like that of growth. To embrace or impose that universalism, don't you think it is dangerous to impose it from Europe? Thank you very much. Of course, you're totally right. With this proposal in a Congress on decolonization, we had to debate for a long time on this, because any intention of universalism, from wherever it comes, is going to be a suspect of something. But a lack of consideration of towards we want to go as a project in international law, or to reject through deliberation the values that we consider as legitimate in order to establish what you have underscored, for instance. Yes, from the international law, third world countries will say these values are imposed to us and relegate us to a subservient situation. But these countries have to resort to human rights, and even those that are more critical have to recognize that without this sphere of international law and the recognition of that plurality, they couldn't develop. Those minority rights exist, and that can be fostered thanks to this emphasis on this. Although you're right, and I agree with you that any pretension of universalism, and this should be perhaps nuanced and formulated carefully, this thesis of universalism, how could it be manifested in a thesis that law cannot be reduced to a mere coercitive function, which is perhaps part of the element that is there in Europe. Apparently, law is only to impose sanctions, and the lack of an ideal, makes it unfeasible to consider any project. What they're signaling at, when they say that law is also called to create, to allow that association, that culture, it is called not only to a legal or juridical function like Kant proposed, the singularities of any individual or of the states from a particular point of view, but also to be based on the ideals of solidarity, which are missing increasingly these days. Besides the function of national and international coexistence, there should be also a job of social assistance, cultural rights, which now move us for what we said initially. It is not enough that people are a little bit more educated, or that we have reduced the indexes of illiteracy, which were 80%. It was absolutely incredible. The pedagogical missions help to remedy a little bit this, but it is not enough to go to university. It is necessary to create associationism, and here there are people who are marvelous examples of representing and embodying institutions, and this gives us platforms to facilitate the creation of these things. Thank you. Thank you, Delia.
Lamentablemente, aunque veo más manos levantadas,
I'm sorry, I can see many, some other hands raised, but please, you can share with her later, because we have to follow the timetable. You can talk to her in person. We close this session, and thank you to the panelists for her participation.